How's it going, everybody, and welcome back to the SFS channel. Today we're going to be talking some more fantasy football draft strategy for the 2021 season with yet another ADP battle with first round running backs. If you want to go check out last week's episode, I broke down Derrick Henry versus Alvin Kamara and ultimately decided which pick I would prefer going with. But for today's video, we've got two more players being drafted in the late first round, well, mid to late first round at that. Ezekiel Elliott and Aaron Jones are the two players up on today's block. So before we get into things, make sure to head down and give this video a like. Let's not waste too much time. Let's hit that intro and get right in to the two players. Alrighty, here we go. So we're going to be kicking off today's video by talking about Aaron Jones. These two players are currently going as the RB8 and 9 in 2021 fantasy football drafts, but I think there's a lot of contrasting elements to their games and a lot of different things that we have to assess when breaking down their 2021 situations. So we're going to start off by recapping their performances from the 2020 season, and then obviously we'll get into how that plays into this coming year. So Aaron Jones, you see it there, finished as the 2020 RB6 for the Green Bay Packers. Obviously, if you remember back to 2019, if you've been playing fantasy for that long, he was the RB2, but he had some very inflated stat categories, particularly in the touchdown department, which is one of the things that so far this offseason I've actually projected a relatively significant increase in that category for him. But the more I assess his situation, the more I'm tending to back off on that, and you'll hear why when I talk about some things later on in today's video. But Aaron Jones was very efficient as always last season, and he's done so throughout his entire career. He hasn't always had the most volume to work with in this Packers offense, as they've tended to keep his workload fairly light for a player that produces as well as he does. But he almost put up 1,500 yards from scrimmage this season and under 250 total touches. So he only had 202 total rushing attempts on the ground, and obviously the rest of that 248 touch load, 46 receptions, comes in the receiving department. So what Jones really hangs his hat on here, and we kind of talk about this with Derrick Henry and Alvin Kamara in last week's episode, is part of the overall analysis came down to volume versus efficiency and which I would rather have in that situation. And in today's video, we're going to end up going a little bit differently than how my overall take played out in that video, because I think that there's just a couple other elements in these two fantasy situations that make me choose my overall outcome for today's video differently. But Aaron Jones is by far the more efficient player here. He averages over and nearly 1.5 yards more output per touch than Ezekiel Elliott did. 1,500 scrimmage yards nearly. As I said, I believe the exact number was 1,459 total yards. And he had about 5.83 yards per touch as compared to Zeke's roughly 1,300 scrimmage yardage output, where he put up 4.41 yards per touch. So there's a couple reasons I think that Aaron Jones has the potential to improve upon his 2020 fantasy performance. And we'll get into barriers to entry, why that might not exactly be the case. But a big reason that I think that he has the opportunity to not only increase his volume and his touch load this season is the simple fact that Jamal Williams is no longer a part of the equation and the fantasy situation in Green Bay. Obviously, they spent a second-round draft pick on A.J. Dillon. I'll touch on that in a couple minutes here as to how I think he factors into this Green Bay backfield. But Jamal Williams was playing a significant role in this Packers offense. Aaron Jones was only on the field for 52% of snaps because Jamal Williams was out there for 40% of it. And if you watched Packer games, and myself being a Packers fan, you can see the Randall Cobb poster up in the background of today's video. Jamal Williams played a bigger role on this team than a lot of people realized, and it takes you watching every single one of those games to recognize that. But there were series where Jamal Williams was taking every snap for the Packers, and that was really, as an Aaron Jones owner in a couple leagues last year, something that was very concerning. And I don't fault the Packers for doing that because Jamal Williams has a very complete skill set. He's not quite as elite as Aaron Jones at any given trait or skill, but he is a very well-rounded player, a very underrated receiving threat, and that's the majority of where his underrated production came from, is the fact that he not only took some touchdowns away, but he was being used as a receiving threat on quite a frequent basis. So no longer having him there in that offense, I think helps Jones gain back some of that production that we saw from him in 2019, where he was a dominant receiving threat. And you can go back to a game in 2019 like he did against the Kansas City Chiefs, where he was putting up insane numbers when I believe Devontae Adams wasn't able to suit up for that game, and Aaron Jones had like over 100 yards through the air in that performance, and like a 50-plus yard score, literally running an out route, like a 10-yard out on a cornerback. He beat for a touchdown because he's just a good route runner, and he's able to be used as a dynamic weapon in this offense. So getting that value, getting that production back could be very significant, and it could play a very real role in how he might improve upon that performance last season. But as we see with all players, typically the trend is that as your volume increases, there is a point where your overall efficiency decreases because it's fatiguing to see more touches and more opportunities, and while that still might net you a greater total yardage output in a game, you're not going to be as fresh on every touch. Every touch won't look the same. You won't have the same opportunity and space every time. Things just begin to change and get a bit different. So we've obviously, again, with the Packers, we've got two very real fantasy situations for Jones that could play out this season. Either we could see Aaron Rodgers as the quarterback for the 2021 season, or we could see Jordan Love, or at this point, who knows, maybe Blake Bortles, depending on whether or not Rodgers is there. I would expect the heavy favorite for that situation B scenario to be Jordan Love. But depending on who that starting quarterback is, it is going to impact Aaron Jones's fantasy value. So I think it wouldn't be very crazy of me to say that Aaron Jones is going to see less volume if Aaron Rodgers is out there on the field. There's going to be more passing attempts in this offense. They're going to be more comfortable throwing the football downfield. And obviously some of those passing attempts are going to go to Aaron Jones. But as a general standpoint here, the Packers offense would pass more in a situation with Aaron Rodgers under center than they would with Jordan Love. So what does that mean for Aaron Jones? Less attempts. And that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to decrease in attempts from last season. But between these two situations, I think that means, as opposed to where a Jordan Love is the quarterback and they might lean on the run game a bit more, you're going to see less attempts as compared to that. But then what that means for the Jordan Love situation is that, again, if he's seeing more volume, more opportunities, if you're leaning on the ground game a bit more, that's going to decrease your efficiency, make the offense a bit more run-dependent and predictable per se, and maybe we see A.J. Dillon secure some of that workload and see him sprinkled in there a bit more. Either way, I don't think it weighs too heavily one way or another on his total output for the season as a whole, but I think you're looking at just a bit of a difference in how we get those numbers. So the one reason and the one thing that I think could potentially play into Aaron Jones' situation that I wasn't currently accounting for earlier on this offseason is how big of an impact I think A.J. Dillon might have on the goal line this year. Aaron Jones had 22 total touchdowns in the 2019 season, 11 total touchdowns in 2020. I was expecting him to get back to maybe 14 or 15, maybe even 13 as a low-end projection for him this season. But I'm not so sure that we wouldn't be grateful for him to hover between 9 and 11 touchdowns again this season because of how big of a threat A.J. Dillon could be on the goal line. He is a very, very big player. The guy has literally nicknamed his own quads. You've seen the stupid quad battles they have out there on Instagram and stuff between Mike Davis, Saquon, and A.J. Dillon. A.J. has named his quads Quadzilla and the Quadfather. Not only does he have a different name for each of them, but they're both very ridiculous, and they were named by himself. So it's not like this was a media creation. Like, these players brought this nonsense upon themselves, and it's as weird as it is, we're talking about it here. So nonetheless, there is a significant, and I think A.J. Dillon as a physically imposing player might actually pose a greater threat to Aaron Jones' touchdown value than Jamal Williams did. Although Jamal was still a bigger back than Aaron Jones was, I think A.J. Dillon is even more of an extreme case in the sense that the dude is nearly 6 feet tall and about 250 pounds. So he is a bowling ball, and once he puts his head down and gets a head of steam, I watched him last season against the Titans put on an absolute show. The dude can rumble in space, and if you put him down on the 3-yard line and ask him to just run over one player, it's pretty hard to stop that if you're a defense. So maybe more significant barriers to touchdown upside than we expect for Aaron Jones this fantasy season. But moving into Ezekiel Elliott now, he hit just about the bottom of the barrel in every statistical category when we take a look at his career-long production and how that's really been impacted by the Cowboys situation offensively last year. And there's been talk nearly every offseason, will Zeke ever get back to his prime numbers? Have we seen the best day from Ezekiel Elliott as a fantasy player? It's literally happened every year since like his second or third season in the league now. And obviously he has re-signed that new contract, a 6-year, $90 million deal with the Cowboys to stay with the franchise probably throughout the fruition of his career, unless they are to dump him off before that contract expires. But a lot of that's guaranteed money, so they're on the books, and I'm guessing he'll be around here with the team regardless. But a lot of last season was completely out of Ezekiel Elliott's control. I mean, the 2020 situation was just bad for this team in general, and when you're starting quarterback Dak Prescott, who I would argue has a bigger impact on Zeke's overall fantasy value than we give him credit for, I mean, you're going to see regression, you're going to see drawback. The quarterback position actually has a bigger effect, and I would say the defense has a bigger effect on a running back's value in fantasy than sometimes I think is brought to light properly by the fantasy community. If you've got a bad defense, your team is going to be passing a whole lot, trying to stay in games, trying to stay relevant down the stretch, and ultimately hold a lead going into the fourth quarter. If you constantly have to play catch up, running the ball just isn't as much of an option for an offense, And conversely, if you've got a bad quarterback, we saw this with the Rams last season. They struggled with their run game for part of the year, and they got things rolling down the stretch. But if your quarterback can't keep drives alive and keep your team on the field, it's just going to lower the efficiency of your offense, and you're just going to see more punts, more time with your defense on the field, and less opportunities for that backfield to flourish and see its total potential for fantasy output. So when Garrett Gilbert, when Ben DiNucci for a game was starting at quarterback for the Cowboys, when Andy Dalton was playing with one of the most injured offensive lines in pro football and was getting absolutely murdered back there, it's a wonder that he didn't see a more significant injury than he did, because he got knocked around pretty good last year. It's going to affect Zeke, and it's going to cause his numbers to suffer here. I mean, to me, the discussion of is Ezekiel Elliott washed at this point is a bit ridiculous, considering that at the time of recording this video, he's still 25 years of age. I get there's extreme situations where Todd Gurley is only 26 years old, I believe, and clearly his best days are behind him, but the guy had arthritis in his knee, which is not something you see every day. And Todd Gurley in his prime was probably the best running back of the last generation post Adrian Peterson. So again, an outlier. It's not every day you see a running back have arthritis in his knee this early in his career. And for a position that sees as much abuse as they do on a play-to-play basis, that's probably one of the worst things you can have as a chronic injury at that position. So again, Zeke, bottom of the barrel in nearly every statistical category last year, but I blame that more so on the situation than I do on Zeke, the player as a whole. I just touched on this. Zeke is 25 as I'm recording this video, but 2 days after this video is going up, he will turn 26 years old, but still very, very young, and a player who, if not in the center of his prime right now, is at the back end of it, but nonetheless, a player I believe is still in his prime, and when focusing in on having a strong comeback season, should be a fairly productive player. But if we look at his yardage and his overall stats last season, his yards per touch were down. The amount of attempts he was seeing per game on the ground were the lowest by nearly 4 or 5 touches per game of any other season. He didn't even hit 17 rushing attempts per game last year. And this goes back to the fact that the Cowboys were probably the worst football team as a whole that they've been since Zeke has been a member of this team. You go back to his rookie season when he was seeing over 20 attempts per game on the ground. They were winning almost all their games. They were a top seed, not the top seed, but one of the top seeds in the NFC heading into the playoffs. They were in the discussion and the conversation for having a bye week in that year's playoff, and they were winning games. And since then, they've peeled back every season. They've been a borderline wild card team every year. But last year was the first time we really saw the Cowboys with Zeke in that offense being kind of a punching bag for other teams, and the only reason they were in the playoff hunt was because they were playing for the NFC East. So They're trailing. They weren't able to run the ball as much. And a lot more of his production really happened in the first 5 games of the season when Dak Prescott was still on the field. Zeke was a bona fide and undisputable top 10 fantasy running back while Dak was still healthy and out there, because Zeke was scoring touchdowns, seeing a lot of goal line opportunities, being involved as a receiver, which is something that's very, very encouraging to watch here play out. And if you talk about some other things that play into a player's fantasy value, like the touchdown count, we touched on it with Aaron Jones just a couple minutes ago. Zeke saw the lowest touchdown total of his entire career last year with just 8. His previous low was 9, but you talk about, again, a player who's hitting his lows in attempts, rushing attempts per game, efficiency on a per-touch basis, and then on top of that, his touchdown total, and that's 8 was his rushing and receiving combined. You're not expecting a player to outperform his previous fantasy seasons, and the fact that he was still able to finish as the RB9 to me is rather encouraging and speaks to his floor value as a whole going forward. So if you haven't gotten the hint already, this video we are taking Ezekiel Elliott as the better fantasy option for this season. I touched on it. They are being drafted as the RB8 and RB9 for 2021 fantasy football. I'm taking Zeke prior to that. I've got him ranked as my RB7 heading into draft day right now, and I've got Aaron Jones rated just a tick lower. But at the end of the day, as opposed to last week's video where I took the efficiency over the volume and the overall workload, this time around, I think that not only does the volume play more to Ezekiel Elliott's favor here, but I also think he has all the potential in the world to increase that efficiency from what we saw last year. And while he probably won't catch an Aaron Jones in terms of his efficiency output on a per-touch basis, he can still improve that number. 4.41 is not an insurmountable mark for any player. It's fairly average if you look at the rest of the pack of the running back group. Give him some offensive line help back. Give him Dak Prescott, who is going to help this offense just be better as a whole. That number is going to head up, especially if Zeke starts seeing more involvement as a receiver, which we saw be part of his fantasy value factored in early last season. That is one of the best ways to improve your efficiency on a per-touch basis at the running back position. So there's a lot of positives, a lot of pros. Nearly everything in his fantasy outlook can get better this season, and I certainly think that some things will get better for Aaron Jones as well. But like I said, in the fact that I, for a time this offseason, was projecting Aaron Jones to see an uptick in touchdown production, since I've backed off on that take and scaled down the number of TDs I think he'll see from a cumulative basis here, I think it pushes things all the more in favor of Zeke here. So both of these, they're RB1s. They're players you want on your team this season. But if you've got the choice between the both of them, I think Ezekiel Elliott is not only the safer pick, and especially if you're concerned about that Aaron Rodgers situation whatsoever, whether it is Jordan Love or Aaron Rodgers, I'm here to tell you I think Aaron Jones will be fine either way. But again, we're just stockpiling reasons right now why I think that Zeke will put up better numbers and be a safer option this year. So both have got solid floors. Both have got really nice ceilings. But I'm taking Zeke in both of those metrics. He's ranked higher in my draft guide rankings. I told you he's my RB7 right now. So I'm taking Zeke on all counts here, all scoring formats. I think he's the better investment for us during the 2021 season. Alrighty, that was episode 5 of ADP Battles here on the SFS channel. If you enjoyed today's video and you're new around here, make sure to head down and subscribe and turn that bell on so you're notified whenever I come out with a new piece of content. I post 6 fantasy videos a week, so there's a lot of information for you all to take advantage of and gather up here as we approach draft day. And obviously, the 2021 season where I'll be posting daily content as well, helping you set your lineups and make sure you're ready and good to go for everything there. But thank you all so much for stopping by today's video. Make sure to leave this video with a like before you head on out, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.